Thank you, Ian, and thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak as part of this wonderful festival. And also, it's rather a great pleasure for me to be back here in Gresham College in this beautiful hall. Right, I'm just going to plug myself in a second. These are no longer the myths of the Greeks. By now, they are ours, and we have made them into the myths we need, the stories through which we seek to understand ourselves. And though they lead only to an acknowledgement of the bitterness of the human predicament, rather than to any kind of solution, that in itself offers some kind of dignity in the face of doom. Every age must re-examine myths because of our desperate need to understand. So those were two quotations from contemporary practitioners and commentators who've dealt on a regular basis with, we might say, the legacy of ancient Mediterranean civilization. The first was by Neil MacGregor, director of the British Museum, and the second was from Sir Peter Hall, theatre director extraordinaire, among whose greatest achievements at the National Theatre stands his production in the 1980s of the Aeschylus Oresteia trilogy. Now, I should say at the outset that I am not a classicist. Ian introduced me as a musicologist, and that's what I am, and that's what I do. Nonetheless, in recent years, I've become fascinated by the way in which the 20th century in particular has received the stories of the Greeks and Romans. What have modern minds found there? Why do they retain a significance and a relevance for us now? Why do we still seem to need them? Well, these questions have fascinated me, and the observations of MacGregor and Hall give a hint as to why. Perhaps even more so in the 20th century, the most violent century known to man, why we keep returning to these tales and characters of the Greeks and turn them into something that we can own in order to try to understand the horrors of our own time and even the terrors that lurk deep within us. It's not without relevance that the last century's most influential psychologists, Freud and Jung, turned to myth in order to help us understand ourselves. Though their ideas may have subsequently been discredited, in part or in whole, it's telling that Jung's notions of archetypal figures and events that we still discuss were derived from ancient myth, while Freud's concept of the Oedipus complex is part of everyday parlance. But there's one ancient personality with whom I've become rather preoccupied, well, you might even say obsessed, in recent years, and that's Orpheus. Orpheus, the first musician, the musician's musician, poet and singer, composer and lyre player. Orpheus, whose songs of lament have echoed down the centuries. Men say that he, by the music of his songs, charmed the stubborn rocks upon the mountains and the course of rivers. That's Apollonius Rhodius, who wrote those words in the Arga Nautica of the 3rd century BC. Orpheus, who charmed nature by his music. Yes, even trees. I need to get trees into my talk somewhere to fit with the theme of the festival, so there we go. One brownie point there. Orpheus, whose singing persuaded Hades to let him pass into the world of the dead. Orpheus, whose lamenting moved all those who heard him to tears. Orpheus, whose head, though severed from his body, still continued to sing. It should hardly surprise us then that Orpheus has long held a fascination for musicians. And since the birth of opera in the late 16th century, Orpheus's song has continually been adapted and reinterpreted on the musical stage, from Claudio Monteverdi's pleading Possente Spirito in the first great opera, Orfeo, of 1607, right through to, well, Harrison Birtwistle's The Corridor, which retells the story now from Eurydice's perspective, a theatre piece that was premiered at Aldeburgh just a couple of years ago. And we can use Orpheus as an exemplar of what's happened to the tales of the ancient Greeks, of the ways in which such stories have been reclaimed by each age, how, to recall MacGregor's words I used at the opening, how they're no longer the myths of the Greeks, but ours. Now, Orpheus dates back at least 3,000 years. He made his first appearance in the 6th century BC, and even by then, he was something of a celebrity. The poet Ibycus describes him as famous Orpheus. Yet his origins remain obscure. Was there a real Orpheus, an historical figure? Or was he merely the product of ancient Greek imagination? Well, these are unanswerable questions. In any case, does it really matter if Orpheus ever existed? Listen to the words of the classical scholar W.K.C. Guthrie. As we try to trace Orpheus back through the ages, he becomes more shadowy, more elusive, more protean in his aptitude for slipping away from anyone who tries to lay actual hands on him and make him tell us just what he is and what he stands for. Who Orpheus is and what he stands for have been different for every generation. Each age has remade Orpheus in its own image. So, for early Christians, for example, Orpheus was a Christ-like figure. The Middle Ages saw Orpheus and Eurydice as courtly lovers. And the 20th century found in the untimely deaths of these beautiful young lovers an allegory for the slaughter of the battlefields of the Somme, or the gulags and death camps, or the devastation of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, or countless other inhumanities of the 20th century, as explored in the work of Rilke, Kokoschka, Cocteau, and many others besides. The myth of Orpheus is really no longer a Greek myth, because it's a vehicle through which we all strive to find a deeper understanding of ourselves. And the same could be said for all those other figures who've dominated the 20th century, dominated 20th century thought, whether that be Oedipus, as I've mentioned, as rethought by Freud, or Ulysses as rethought by Joyce, or Antigone as rethought by Cocteau and Ennui, or Apollo as rethought by the NASA space project in the 1960s, or countless other examples. I'm sure you can think of many more for yourselves. Orpheus can be found in many ancient literary sources, as well as on vase paintings, sculptures, coins, and more often than not depicted as a lyre player. But there were two narratives that had the greatest impact on later interpretations of the Orpheus myth, both written in Latin at much the same time. The fourth book of Virgil's Georgics, which dates from around 29 BC, and Ovid's Metamorphoses from between 1 and 8 AD. And Ovid's subject is quite simply, as the title of the text tells us, change, transformation, metamorphosis. Of bodies changed to other forms I tell, you gods who have yourselves wrought every change, inspire my enterprise and lead my lay in one continuous song from nature's first remote beginnings to our modern times. Those are Ovid's opening words, and they continue to ring true for, if you like, more recent modern times. The world is in a continual state of flux. Now, Ovid weaves together over 250 mythological stories interpreted as tales of transformation of people and objects from one state to another. Bacchus, for example, avenges the murder of Orpheus by turning the Thracian women into oak trees. There's my second tree reference. But in a larger sense, Ovid sanctions the continual reinterpretation and metamorphosis of these stories. As E.J. Kenny writes, Ovid rings the changes on the theme of change itself. And while composers have only fitfully turned to Ovid, when they have, one can understand, to put it very crudely, why Ovid's message is one to which musicians in particular would readily respond, most especially in music since, well, let's say, since around about 1800, in which change, transformation, or to be slightly more musically technical about it, development, have been given a primacy. So at the most basic level, we might say the art of composition is the art of metamorphosis. Take an idea, a musical idea, and transform it into something else. To give just a very obvious example, think of one of the most famous musical ideas of all. It's a bold, four-note rhythmic motif. Any idea what I'm talking about? Exactly. The opening motif of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And then think of the metamorphosis that motif takes across the course of the first movement of that symphony, across all four movements of that symphony as a whole. Think how just one idea is transformed into a completely different idea, yet retains its essence. We might also say how, if you like, the dark despair at the start of that symphony, C minor, is transformed into the triumphal light of C major at the end of the fourth movement. Beethoven gives his idea mythopoeic status. And it's also been suggested, incidentally, I think the first person to suggest this was in the mid-19th century, the A.B. Marx, that Beethoven's contemporaneous fourth piano concerto, he started work on this before he'd completed the Fifth Symphony, was based on the Orpheus myth, as told by Virgil and Ovid. There was certainly a particular interest in Orpheus in Vienna in those years. However, I'm distracting myself because my subject is not Beethoven. I've chosen to talk about Britten and Stravinsky as two key composers who are prominently represented in this year's City of London Festival, and for whom important anniversaries fall this year. Now, you don't need me to point out that 1913 was the year of Britten's birth, on the 22nd of November, to be precise, St. Cecilia's Day, the patron saint of music. The 29th of May, 1913, is branded on my forehead as another very significant date, because that was the date that saw the notorious public premiere in Paris of a ballet with music by Igor Stravinsky that remains perhaps his best-known work, and which, for better or worse, came to define musical modernism. I'm referring, of course, to The Rite of Spring. But before I take a look at the significance of the classical past for both these composers individually, and their responses were distinctly different, I should say that there was a good degree of common ground between the two. For one thing, they shared the same publisher for a period in Boosey and Hawkes, and who would regularly supply Stravinsky in America, where he was then living, on request with copies of Britten's scores. Stravinsky was clearly fascinated by what his younger fellow composer was up to. Topical for our purposes here is that, thinking of the current production going on at Covent Garden, he asked for a score of Gloriana. He wrote to Leslie Boosey in September 1953, after he sent him the score, "Many thanks for the beautiful edition of Gloriana, which arrived safely. Now I wish to have a chance to hear it, because I find the music very interesting." Well, I'm intrigued to know what Stravinsky saw in the score in the early 1950s that so resonated with him. And it should be remembered that this was a time of particular crisis for Stravinsky. He just finished his only full-length opera that he ever wrote, The Rake's Progress. That was premiered in 1951, and he was now starting to take his music in a very different direction, engaging for the first time with the serial method as expounded by Arnold Schoenberg and his students in Vienna in the 1920s. So what did he see in Gloriana? Fascinating. But it's clear that Stravinsky followed Britten's progress with interest. And it's also clear that Britten had an impact on Stravinsky's work, even though the senior composer would never have acknowledged it. In 1952, Britten wrote his second canticle, called Abraham and Isaac. In 1962-3, 10 years later, Stravinsky produced his own Abraham and Isaac. Coincidence? In Stravinsky's late TV opera, The Flood, of 1961-62, the text is derived in part from the Chester Mystery play about Noah's flood, this self-same source that Britten used in 1957 for his telling of the same tale of Noah's flood. The voice of God is cast by Stravinsky in his opera for two basses. The one part of God with two singers who sing two separate lines, but that move simultaneously in rhythmic unison, two figures representing the one voice. Well, where did he get this idea from? He'd never done it before. The voice of God in Britten's Abraham and Isaac is represented in just the same way, now with an alto and tenor, moving two different parts, moving in rhythmic unison to represent the voice of God. I leave you to draw your own conclusions. Stravinsky, though, had always been a musical magpie, taking whatever he wanted. He later, through Robert Kraft, described himself as a musical kleptomaniac. But it was only natural, I suppose, that he should try and put people off the scent of where he'd got his ideas from. He was often quite mean about Britten in private. Take this from a letter from Stravinsky to his friend Nicholas Nabokov in 1949, written from Los Angeles on the only occasion, at least as far as I'm aware, that the two composers actually met when Britten was out touring in America. All week I've listened to Aunt Britten and Uncle Piers. Britten himself makes quite a favourable impression, and he is very popular with the public. He undoubtedly has talent as a performer, especially at the piano. No mention of Britten, the composer. When in 1965 Stravinsky and Britten were jointly awarded the Erasmus Prize, Stravinsky declined it. "How tactless these Dutch," he wrote. As for Britten, Stravinsky was an ever-present part of his composing life. He studied Stravinsky's scores from early on, and they left their mark, as it should be said did other important early modernists for Britten, most especially Mahler and Berg. But particularly the neoclassical works of Stravinsky, they left their mark on his formal and harmonic thinking. As Peter Pears once pointed out, Stravinsky's Apollo of 1928 was a key influence on Britten's emerging voice in the 1930s, as I hope we'll hear a little later on. I'm going to return to Apollo shortly, who in fact punctuates key moments in Britten's output. But first of all, I'd like to take you to a work that you're going to have the chance to hear, I've just gathered, twice next week in the flesh, once in its original version for oboe and also in another version for saxophone. And I'm talking about the 6 Metamorphoses after Ovid of 1951, originally composed for oboe by Britten. Each movement is a musical portrait of a different figure from the Metamorphoses: Pan, Phaeton, Niobe, Bacchus, Narcissus, and Arethusa. Most of these have watery associations. In keeping with the commission, the piece was commissioned to be played on the water at Thorpe Ness. And the solo oboe is clearly a reed pipe, the aulos, if you like, from antiquity, as played by the satyr Pan. And that's where we begin. Pan is the first movement. The reed pipe is, in fact, Pan's beloved nymph, water nymph, Syrinx, who's been changed into reeds. "You and I shall stay in unison," says Pan in Metamorphoses, and waxed together reeds of different lengths and made the pipes that keep his darling's name. To the accompaniment of a helicopter, I'm sorry about that. That's the first third of the opening movement, a sort of A-B-A shape. And I think you can already hear how the very first falling idea that you hear played by the oboe is being worked throughout this movement, the same musical idea constantly being transformed in various ways. The fifth movement is a portrait of Narcissus. And it presents even more opportunities for the kinds of games that composers so love to play. The youth Narcissus fell in love, as I'm sure you remember, with his own reflection in a silvery pond and was transformed into a flower. The music has three statements. That is, if you like, it's a short set of variations on the opening idea that ripple across the water in demi-semi-quaver figures. You'll hear the sort of the rippling effects very clearly. But the music is also full of reflections. Rising ideas are immediately echoed as falling ones, and vice versa. And you will hear very clearly one idea presented low in the oboe, reflected high, or the other way round. And now the third statement. So there's a process of metamorphosis going on throughout the piece. None of those statements are exact. Each one is a reworked version of itself, if you like. And you can hear those reflections. And no, they're not echoes. They are reflections. You sing an echo, and it comes back at you in the same form. These are reflections because they are inversions of the original music. Now let's go back almost a decade and a half to 1939. Britain's in the USA, where he's gone for a complex of reasons, but in part as a kind of sabbatical to escape the stifling atmosphere he found in England as the wunderkind of music. At the outbreak of war, as a pacifist, he decided to remain in America. But the difficult atmosphere at home was not just one created by his phenomenal success at a young age, but also by various complex relationships. In the summer of 1938, Britten Aged 24, had met a German youth 7 years his junior called Wolf Scherchen, son of the conductor Hermann Scherchen. As John Bridcut writes in his book, the references incidentally are all on your handout sheet. In 1938-39, Wolf Scherchen was the most important person in Britten's life, and he was still at school. He, more than any other, was the figure who embodied Aschenbach's and Britten's own dilemma in Death in Venice, that is the Thomas Mann novella, the enchantment he found in the beauty of boys. That's the end of the Bridcut quote. Over the Atlantic and away from Scherchen, Britten was commissioned to write a curtain raiser for piano and strings. He called it Young Apollo, which is also to be heard. Has it already been heard? Or it has already been heard, the festival, so some of you were there, I'm sure. Young Apollo, headed with a quotation from Keats's Hyperion that speaks of the god of beauty's limbs celestial and golden tresses. Britten wrote about it to Wolf Scherchen in a letter, and there was no doubt who he had in mind in making this portrait of Apollo. It doesn't sound like that. It sounds more like this. So it's an extraordinary piece that was not lost for many years, but Britten withdrew it not long after the premiere, and it was only resurrected, shall we say, as recently as 1979 at Aldborough, 3 years after Britten's death. But it's music that is at once restrained, in that as you hear, it's just A major, it doesn't do anything else, it never leaves that key for its whole 7 to 10 minute duration. And yet, it's full of youthful exuberance, a piano part written for Britten himself to play, to show off with, no doubt. Youth and beauty, innocent, naive almost, one might say, yet knowing too. Through the Greek god of beauty and order, Apollo, Britten finds the means of expressing directly yet covertly his idealized vision of youth. Just like the unchanging A major, this youthful beauty never fades. It never grows up. And more than 30 years later, in his last opera, Death in Venice, after the Mann novella, which is currently running at ENO, Britten returns to Apollo, but now an ill man contemplating his own death, which came just 3 years after the completion of the opera. It was finished and premiered in 1973. He invests himself into the elderly novelist at the heart of the novella and the opera, Gustav von Aschenbach. Aschenbach contemplates from afar and is caught by the allure of a beautiful youth called Tadju. It's another Wolfscherchen, if you like, or one of the many other boys on the threshold of adolescence with which Britten had been infatuated during his life. As Bridcut again writes, the opera laid bare the turbulence in Britten's own mind, which for most of his career had so enriched his music. And here this is cast as a contest between, once again, Apollo, god of beauty and order, on the one hand, and on the other, Dionysus, the god of instinct, of passion, of unbridled, untrammeled libido. And towards the end of the opera, in a dream, the two sides of Aschenbach pull in different directions. These are represented by the voice of Dionysus and the voice of Apollo. Dionysus sings, "Do not refuse the mysteries." Apollo, "No, love, reason, beauty, form." Dionysus, "He who denies the god denies his nature." Apollo, "No, be ruled by me and by my laws." This was the continual dilemma of Britten's own life, primal instinct versus ordered behaviour. We hear and see the dance of the followers of Dionysus with, at its climax, the musical sounds of the oriental other, the Balinese gamelan, as so often in Britten, suggesting the seductive, the exotic, the allure of the forbidden. And now the dance of the followers of Dionysus begins. Cut out before we hear the wailing of Peter Pears at that point. He's meant to be wailing, I should say, at that particular moment. Tadju, the young boy in the opera, the youth, is played by a dancer, a mute dancer. And it was principally through the ballet that Igor Stravinsky explored also the lure of Apollo and other figures from the classical past, most notably in his collaboration with the dancer and choreographer George Balanchine. The agreement of Stravinsky and Balanchine on such aesthetic matters as classical order and on the temporal dimension of music and dance resulted in an extraordinary unity of creative vision. Their three great classical ballets, Apollo, Orpheus, and Agon, stand as witness to this. Stravinsky trusted Balanchine deeply. I do not see how one can be a choreographer unless, like Balanchine, one is a musician first, he said. Stravinsky would listen to Balanchine. They planned projects in detail together. He'd even change his music at Balanchine's suggestions, something this all-controlling composer would do for no one else. Many of Stravinsky's most celebrated scores were initiated and guided by this man, 22 years his junior. Both artists had begun as progressive modernists. Stravinsky before the war preeminently on the 29th of May 1913 with The Rite of Spring, Balanchine in the early 1920s with work inspired by the experimental choreography of Kassian Golesovsky, whose near-nude dancers were placed in abstract formations amidst constructivist decor. For both Balanchine and Stravinsky, their discovery of the past in the interwar years transformed their thinking and led to a paring down of their musical and choreographic languages. In particular, their shared discovery of classical antiquity put them in direct touch with broader developments in interwar Art Deco Europe. Many of the artists in Paris in whose circle Stravinsky moved were turning to classical subject matter in the years of the First World War and after. Apollinaire, Debussy, Cocteau, Gide, Milhaud, Picasso, Satie, to name just a few. Stravinsky would eventually follow their examples when, towards the end of the 1920s, he worked with Jean Cocteau on his opera oratorio Oedipus Rex, after Sophocles. But this was by no means Stravinsky's first encounter with classical art. He had for more than a decade been working in the midst of an emerging Parisian Art Deco culture that referenced and reinterpreted antiquity. Indeed, the importance of classical models as the basis for a new art, for modernism, had been at the heart of the early productions of the famous Ballet Russe company, most notably Cherepnin's Narcissus of 1911 and Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe of 1912. The designer of these productions had been a man called Leon Bakst, one of the architects of a movement called Mir Iskусства, the World of Art movement, which was founded at the end of the 19th century in St. Petersburg by none other than Sergei Diaghilev, the impresario of the Ballet Russe. And Bakst in 1909 had published in the journal called, interestingly, Apollo, an essay entitled The Paths of Classicism in Art. And he gives a prescient vision of the post-war Parisian synthesis of, if you like, high art and haute couture. Fashion, he writes, is everywhere that art is to be found. He'd been deeply impressed by the American Isadora Duncan, dancing barefoot, as he said, in a revealing Greek tunic in St. Petersburg as early as December 1904. And Duncanism, as it became known, took a strong hold on the Ballet Russe. And on the back of your handout, you'll see a sculpture by the French sculptor Bourdelle called La Danse, which stands outside just over the entrance to the Comédie, one of the halls at the Théâtre Champs-Élysées, the brand new building opened in 1913 where The Rite of Spring was premiered. And these two Greek-looking figures are in fact Václav Nijinsky, who choreographed The Rite of Spring, and Isadora Duncan, but cast in the guise of a Greek god and goddess. It sort of does my work for me, really. Bakst saw the art of the future as being deliberately uncomplicated, moving towards a new and very simple form. Artists, he wrote, will return, like the Greeks of Periclean Athens, to proclamations of the beauty of nature. So Bakst heralds the birth of a new classical art. Stravinsky's overt turn towards the classical after the First World War and his apparent moving away from progressive modernism perplexed many. Leonid Sabanayev, for example, writing of Apollo, was scathing of Stravinsky's volte-face away from the likes of The Rite of Spring. I love this description. The Bolshevik, the Lenin and Trotsky of music. has become a peaceful rentier, spending the rest of his days in a suburban villa. But does Stravinsky's Apollo really signal the disappearance of the revolutionary Stravinsky? Like Art Deco more generally, Stravinsky and Balanchine embraced the classical past not to repeat it, but to reinvent it, turning it to their own modern purposes. Their reconfiguration of the classical past was a process of, if you like, objectivizing, formalizing, simplifying, but also of distancing from the past, distancing from direct emotion and expression. And behind the masks of their three great classical ballets lies also, I would suggest, an uncertainty, a questioning, a sense of loss after the First World War and Russian revolutions. Stravinsky, in exile in Switzerland during the war, had lost loved ones and homeland. After 1917, he did not return to Russia until 1962. The classical art of antiquity, as well as the classical music of Western Europe, became Stravinsky's new home. Apollo, or Apollon Musagette as it was first called, was Stravinsky's first collaboration proper with Balanchine. It was written mainly in Nice in the latter part of 1927 and finished early 1928. And Stravinsky later generously, unusually for him, acknowledged the early success of the ballet as being attributable to the beautiful choreography of Balanchine. And you can just see a still from Balanchine's choreography on the handout there, the beautiful classical shapes that he makes. For Balanchine, Apollo marked a creative epiphany that enabled him to pare down his modernist choreographic style. He wrote this: "Apollo I look back on as the turning point of my life. In its discipline and restraint, in its sustained oneness of tone and feeling, the score was a revelation for me. It seemed to tell me that I could dare not to use everything, that I too could eliminate." Stravinsky had decided, as he said, to compose a ballet founded on moments or episodes in Greek mythology, plastically interpreted by dancing of the so-called classical school. So, following the prologue depicting the birth of Apollo, the three muses, Calliope, Polyhymnia, and Terpsichore, are introduced before the work proceeds through a series of conventional variations entirely in keeping with the traditions of the classical ballet. A coda is then reached for all four dancers before the final apotheosis, in which simply Apollo leads the three muses towards Parnassus. So thus, the narrative is really stripped of any clear meaning. It's a very simple tale. And what's left is a kind of abstract meditation on classical themes. I'm tempted to rename it Apollon et sa méditation. And again, on your handout, you'll find another of Baudel's sculptures from the Théâtre Champs-Élysées. This one is the frieze right at the top of the theatre. It has that very title, Apollon et sa méditation. And you can see at the centre of that picture is Apollo. This was made in 1912, but this is a kind of Art Deco representation of Apollo, the ancient past turned into something very modern. And such a description is equally appropriate, I think, to Balanchine's restrained sculptural choreography, where music and dance are unified in the expression of pure classical beauty. Stravinsky himself described Apollo as a ballet blanc, a white ballet, in that the music also eschews contrast, pares down the scoring to just the strings, and employs principally diatonic harmony, that is, just, if you like, using the white notes of the piano keyboard. So here's the start of the birth of Apollo, which some of you may also have heard as part of the festival last week. And so how did Stravinsky achieve this sense of order as symbolized by the Greek god Apollo? Well, by making it his most thoroughly French work to date. He explicitly turned his back on his own earlier music, as I've hinted earlier on, by trying, as he later said, to discover a melodism free of folklore. And one means of achieving this was by looking to French poetry. The real subject of Apollo, he once claimed, is versification. Each dance explores a basic iambic pattern, short, long. You heard that just there. Ta-tum, ta-ti, ta-tum, those rhythms. The variation of Calliope is headed by 2 lines from Nicolas Boileau, the poet at the court of Louis XIV, and takes the 12-syllable lines of the French Alexandrine as its rhythmic model. It also references French Baroque dances. That ta-tam, ta-tam rhythm is also the rhythm of the French overture style of the Baroque. That's there in The Birth of Apollo, or there's a Pavane-like second variation of Apollo. But ultimately what this leads to is a music that speaks not of the past but of the present. This white note Hellenism, if you like, points more to a figure like Satie than it does back to Lully. As Paul Griffiths in his book on Stravinsky quips, he says the Gallic spirit of Apollo is a complex superimposition of Lully and Delibes, Daphnis and the Ritz. Stravinsky and Balanchine have turned a Greek god into French chic. That was the variation of Calliope. In 1946, following another terrible war, Stravinsky and Apollo, that was a Freudian slip, if there was. Stravinsky and Balanchine now turn to Apollo's son, Orpheus. And it's the lamenting Orpheus who's encountered at the start of the ballet that bears his name. Orpheus weeps for Eurydice, as the score tells us. He stands motionless with his back to the audience. And we hear his lyre, represented by the sounds of the harp, playing repeated falling lines in a conventional sign of lament. It echoes outwards into the strings who linger over the notes of the harp. As I said at the start, the premature deaths of the youthful Orpheus and Eurydice took on particular resonance in the violent 20th century. An artist turned, as so often before, to myth as a way of coming to terms with events that were literally unspeakable. So it's telling that Stravinsky began work on Orpheus within a year of the end of the Second War. Though the idea for the subject came directly from Balanchine, it struck a chord with Stravinsky at this moment. Never one to reveal his true feelings, it was behind the mask of Orpheus that he was best able to come to terms with a series both of tragic personal losses and, more generally, his anxieties for the world's situation during and after the war. He would still surely have felt the tragedy of the late 1930s when, in rapid succession, within about 7 months, his first daughter, his first wife, and mother had all died. Now, once more an émigré in the USA, Stravinsky experienced the horrors and privations of the Second War only at a distance, separated from his family in Europe, following the terrifying events from afar, including the destruction of his native city, then known as Leningrad. And it's a sense of distance, too, that in general characterises the apparently timeless Orpheus, the score. Yet beneath this universalised ritual, the work seems for me to speak more personally and of its time. It's striking that Orpheus is Stravinsky's only score since The Firebird of 1910, in which the term espressivo, expressively, occurs frequently. In April 1946, Balanchine and Stravinsky worked side by side on the scenario and timings. Music and choreography emerged simultaneously, and they developed a scenario that starts, as we've heard, with Orpheus weeping at Eurydice's funeral and ends with an apotheosis, where Apollo wrests the lyre from Orpheus and raises his son heavenwards. But the music throughout is restrained, distanced. The sense of formality is reinforced by such things as counterpoint. And the designer eventually chosen for the premiere production was someone called Isamu Noguchi, a sculptor whose abstract geometries, sets and costumes and masks perfectly match the distilled ritualistic purity of Stravinsky's music and Balanchine's dances. And you've got a photograph of that, Balanchine rehearsing Orpheus. The only really violent music in the work is the second pas d'action, where the bacchantes attack Orpheus, seize him and tear him to pieces. But even here the music is disciplined. Orpheus doesn't offer a depiction of the violence of war, but rather reflects on it. The violent, mechanical repetitions, the ostinatos and rhythmic energy of the Rite of Spring are still to be heard, but now with a sense of detachment. This, above all else, is what the classical past gave to Stravinsky. Not a turning back to ancient Greece, but a universal story retold for a new age. And this myth in particular gave him the context in which he could sing laments of loss. In the air de danse, Orpheus sings for the loss of Eurydice. To the accompaniment of the lyre, the harp once again, a pair of obligato oboes gives voice to a deeply melancholic lament, weaving lines around each other in grief, echoing an aria from a Bach passion, if you like. Stravinsky glances back both to ancient Greece and to the 18th century, but in so doing, he highlights the chasm between his own time and Bach's or ancient Greece, articulating uncertainty and alienation. Sadly, time doesn't permit me to play any more, but you can go away and listen to it for yourselves. A few concluding thoughts. In the cases of both Britten and Stravinsky, I think it's fair to say that the evaluation that I began with, the words of Neil MacGregor about the role of myth in present society, still hold, more or less. At key moments in the creative lives of both these composers, they turned to the classical past in order to try to understand the present. Greek antiquity had little to do with history. Apollo, or whoever, was an idea, a utopian ideal that stood for an inaccessible past and associated values of order, wholeness, and unity, from which either the subject or more generally the modern age had become alienated. In Death in Venice, the voice of Apollo, as we heard, sings of the ideals of love, reason, beauty, form. And yet in acknowledging this, Aschenbach, and via him Britten, also recognises the lure of its passionate opposite. What is art itself compared to the rewards of chaos, sings Aschenbach. But in playing out an argument between Dionysus and Apollo that goes back at least as far as Socrates, both character and composer, at the ends of both their lives, find some sort of solace, if not resolution. Stravinsky's reinvention of Greek classicism carries a double bind. First, it recognises that the unified past has been lost forever, even while expressing the desire in the wake of war and revolution for the restoration of its values. It's a desire, however, that's destined to fail, as heard in the melancholic apotheoses at both the end of Apollo and Orpheus, but in ways that echo the Art Deco milieu in which he moved. It's the dialogue between past and present that's crucial. This forms a highly pertinent expression, it seems to me, both of modernist aesthetics and of the post-World War situation. And secondly, and more personally, as an émigré, as much of his own making as a victim of the political circumstances, Stravinsky appropriated these exemplars of high Western European culture in order to distance himself from his own Russian backwaters, as he might have said. Yet the myths he came to inhabit were not his own, and he remained distanced from those too. The classical past became a vehicle for articulating the losses and alienation of exile. So, these are just two examples. You can find many counter-examples, I'm sure, of a classical past being used as, say, a source for the comic or the ironic or the merely decorative. Just think of Poulenc's surreal Les Mamelles de Tiresias, after the play by the appropriately self-named Apollinaire. But in all cases, what's extraordinary to me is that the stories and figures of antiquity still have a lure, still demand to be retold and remade for our own times, because, as Peter Hall put it, of our desperate need to understand. It would seem we have as much need for Apollo today as we ever did. Thank you very much.